In retrospect, Super Mario RPG was a recipe for success, but that wasn't exactly clear at the time. Taking a franchise that was known for its simple but effective real-time platforming and completely flipping the script was a risky play, one that really shouldn't work on paper, but surprisingly, it does. To the point where nearly 30 years later, it has become one of the most beloved RPGs of all time, a real lightning-in-a-bottle moment. Not every game is made for everyone, and if there's one subgenre that comes to mind when I think of this, it would be RPGs, specifically the Japanese variety. Turn-based combat is a big barrier for most people to overcome, and I don't fully blame players for avoiding certain games because of it. I mean, when the main activity isn't for you, then you'd be hard-pressed to find any enjoyment. This dilemma has plagued JRPGs for decades, and back in the 90s, Squaresoft was looking for a way to expand their horizons and make an RPG with worldwide appeal. It turns out that Nintendo was actually interested in collaborating with them around this time, and what this resulted in was a one-of-a-kind experience. So for today, we're going to be taking a quick look at Super Mario RPG, analyzing its strengths and weaknesses, and seeing why this game works as well as it does. Something that I like a lot about old school RPGs is how straight to the point they are, and Super Mario RPG is no exception. Really, how the game opens is actually pretty genius. Hot off the heels of an unseen adventure, Mario storms Bowser's castle, making his way to the big man himself and saving the day once again. Though celebrations are cut short when this massive sword falls from the sky, piercing the castle and making the declaration that it's now property of Smithy and his gang of misfits. Not only that, but we find out that some of Smithy's gang have already begun to execute their plans to collect the shattered pieces of the Star Road, a magic bridge that acts as the source of all wishes granted in the Mushroom Kingdom. While Mario initially embarks on his journey to go rescue Peach, he's eventually roped into this deeper plot when he runs into this kid named Mallow, a cloud creature that believes himself to be a tadpole, and this possessed doll from the Star Road named Gino. It's clear that Smithy collecting the star pieces is nothing but trouble, so Gino asks Mario to assist him in putting an end to his plans and restore peace to the Mushroom Kingdom. Boom, that's all you need to know. Super Mario RPG does not have a complicated or deep story. Really, it's only a smidge deeper than your average Mario plot. There's a bad guy up to no good, and Mario and his gang are the ones tasked with taking him down. It's a simple story that doesn't have much to it in regards to character arcs and themes. But would you believe me if I said this was to the game's strength? One of the goals with Mario RPG was to make an experience that would appeal to fans and newcomers alike. At this point in time, RPGs were starting to become more complicated in regards to their narratives. For example, Final Fantasy had already adopted to using politics as a method of storytelling. There are games that spend time building up the world, how it functions, different factions and their beliefs, and what people in power are willing to exploit for their own benefit. Mario's world is inherently much less complicated than that. The mainline games already have almost zero story and rarely any dialogue. While it might have been tempting to create a much deeper story than what's already here, it wouldn't feel like a Mario game anymore. So what Square opted to do instead was to tell a Mario story, but with the same gravitas as a standard RPG. And you know what? It works really well. Mario RPG can be a pretty funny game. I wouldn't exactly call it a parody of RPGs, as it does take its own story somewhat seriously, but it does manage to have a sense of humor, whether that be through the game's literal dialogue or in visual gags. I really like what they did with Mario here. While he might not be able to talk, that doesn't mean he isn't an expressive character. I'm a huge fan of how he shapeshifts into different characters just to explain events to others. It doesn't happen much, but I find it pretty endearing. Mario characters never really had that much of a personality before this. Sure, there were those crappy cartoons, but the video games didn't touch on this at all until this point. This is one of those aspects that I think we take for granted now, but Super Mario RPG really struck gold with the characterization of the Mario cast. Sure, it's nothing all that in-depth or compelling, but the fact that they took these flat pieces of cardboard and gave them endearing traits is pretty impressive. For example, normally Peach is a character that's seldom used in the main games, mostly just being your typical damsel in distress. However, in this game, she's a lot more proactive, volunteering to join Mario's crew in his quest after she's rescued from Booster. Peach even goes as far as to sneak out of the castle against her kingdom's wishes to make that a possibility. Making her one of the best party members in the game was also a tasteful choice to support the idea that she doesn't always need to be some goal to achieve. It sucks that this is the only time where Peach is allowed to be an active party member in these games. Sure, she gets a lot of dialogue and screen time in the later RPGs, but she's never allowed to get fully involved with the adventure for some reason. It makes her inclusion in this game feel refreshing, and also ties into the idea of this story being some massive event within the Mario world. But here's the thing. If we're gonna talk about characterization in Mario RPGs, then there's no way I can't mention Bowser. Super Mario RPG dares ask the question of what our status quo main villain gets up to when the spotlight is no longer on him. Bowser couldn't care less about what Smithy plans on doing with the star pieces or how his gang is threatening the kingdom. The only thing Bowser cares about is kicking Smithy's ass for jacking his castle. There's a supreme lack of self-awareness with this guy that adds this endearing quality to him. I like how basically everyone in the Mushroom Kingdom treats Bowser as a joke, but he still sees himself as the main character regardless. Bowser doesn't join your team, no, you join his. That tinge of insecurity masked by explosive confidence easily makes Bowser my favorite character in this game, and I'm glad that this was the basis of his characterization in the RPGs going forward. And then there's Geno and Mallow. Two original characters made specifically for this game, and haven't appeared since. Between the both of them, Geno is significantly favored by fans of this game, and I can see why. He's got a cool design, his backstory and status gives him an air of importance, and he manages to tear in combat. If you were a kid in the 90s, that's all you really needed for a character to be considered cool. But aside from that, there's not a whole lot to Geno's character. Mallow, on the other hand, is a bit more involved. He's the only party member that goes through any sort of growth, initially starting as a bit of a pushover crybaby, before eventually gaining some confidence thanks to his new friends. Yeah, it's a basic character, but it's something that I think a lot of kids can relate to. As an adult, I'm at the very least glad Mallow wasn't written to be some constant coward afraid to do anything, since that's a trap that a lot of people fall into when it comes to this trope. Super Mario RPG's story is short and to the point. There's not much in the way of fluff, and the pacing is consistent enough that you'd be hard-pressed to find yourself getting bored. There's enough deviation in the game's structure to keep the narrative pattern feeling fresh. But I won't lie and say that this is the greatest story in Mario RPGs, because yeah, it's by the numbers. But as a first crack at adapting this franchise into a different genre, what we got was pretty decent. This is not the type of game you play for the story, it's more so an added bonus. Where Super Mario RPG really found its stride is in the gameplay. When you think of 90s Squaresoft, the only thing that will realistically come to mind is the Final Fantasy active time battle system. Back then, Square was on a roll, constantly putting out high-quality RPGs that have gone on to define the era. However, something you might notice is that most of them were cut from the same ATB cloth. And back in the 90s, this was what Square games played like. It would have been easy to just copy and paste this formula, change some graphics, and call it a day. But Square and Nintendo decided to go for something a bit different. Since Mario games are action platformers with an emphasis on real-time input, the decision early on was to keep that in Mario RPG in some form or another, and what the team ended up going with was surprising for the time. Mario RPG's battle system on the surface is traditional. You got 3 party members, each one of them specializing in different combat roles. Mario is the all-rounder character, good stats and solid attacks. Mallow is sort of the black mage of the group, getting access to decent area of effect magic early. Geno is a Swiss Army knife of a character, having strong physical and magical abilities on top of a buff. Peach is mostly support with some offensive capabilities, and Bowser is a full-on bruiser, specializing almost entirely on physical moves with only a handful of so-so special attacks. Every character has a distinct role in battle, and are able to synergize with each other rather well. Battles are fairly straightforward in Mario RPG, so team crafting hinges almost entirely on your ability to adapt to the situation. Enemies take little damage to magic? Put Bowser in. Dealing with a lot of enemies at once? Mallow and Geno should be your go-to, with whoever you use depending on elemental affinity and resource management. Peach is fantastic for bosses, but only okay for random fights, at the very least from my experience anyway. Since Mario is a mandatory party member, there are only so many different combinations of characters at your disposal. This makes finding whatever team you need for the area quick and easy, which is a positive for a beginner-centric RPG. Though, as a veteran, I would have appreciated the option to swap out Mario for the sake of experimentation. What sets Super Mario RPG's combat apart from the rest was the inclusion of action commands. Believe it or not, this was a novel idea at the time, one that I think works in the context of this being a Mario RPG. Mario is a franchise that's associated with real-time gameplay, and it's been like this since the character's conception. There's always going to be a certain expectation with Mario titles that the player has direct control over Mario's actions as much as possible. This is what made Super Mario RPG such a risk at the time. When you're used to Mario games playing a certain way for years, the idea that the next entry would abandon all of that is a bit off-putting. So instead of transforming Mario into something that it isn't, in this case, a Final Fantasy game, the RPG genre was instead morphed and altered to fit more in line with the Mario franchise itself. The mission statement with Super Mario RPG wasn't to make an RPG starring Mario characters. It was to make an RPG that felt like a Mario game. This meant that nearly all of the actions available in the traditional franchise would be possible to do here. Mario attacks with shells, hammers, jumps on enemies, and shoots fireballs. These features being here are not only for the sake of being visually familiar to fans, but they also mechanically function in the exact same way. Nearly every attack in Super Mario RPG has a timing minigame tied to it. For example, selecting an enemy with your basic attack deals minimal damage, but if you press the attack button at the correct timing, your damage output increases. There's a soft window where the attack is a little stronger, but then there's also a 5-frame window where the attack can deal double the damage. The timing of this minigame varies between characters and the type of weapon that they have equipped. It's not much, but that slight variation does a lot in keeping players on their toes. This same rule applies to blocking, though it's a lot more limited. Only physical attacks can be guarded like this, and it's the same general rule. Soft blocking subtracts some damage, but perfectly blocking negates all damage. Something that is way easier said than done. At least in the original version of the game, magic is something that can't be guarded against, and I'm a bit mixed on that decision. On one hand, it makes it so that the action command isn't the end-all be-all for combat encounters. Mid to late game bosses love their magic attacks. This means that if you were banking solely on your guarding skills, you're gonna be in for a rude awakening. It teaches new players that sometimes strategies need to change in order for them to find success. On the other hand, the fact that magic follows this rule is a bit arbitrary, and makes certain attacks feel more unfair than they might have been if all had the ability to be guarded. For example, bombs have this self-destruct gimmick. When they're at low health, they'll try to rush in and take out one of your party members. But with proper timing, it's possible to guard against this and keep them alive. Okay, so the game has now established that explosions are something we can guard against. However, attacks where enemies throw static bombs at the player cannot be guarded. Despite the fact that both of these attacks fundamentally are based on the idea of blocking an explosion, only one of them is a valid action. It just doesn't feel right and will confuse newcomers. This is one of those things that I hear the remake fixed. Not only can you block most spells in that one, attacks that can't be guarded have a clear indicator of such. Though I'm not sure if I agree with the idea of showing the player the timings of every attack so explicitly. Part of what makes the battle system of this game so satisfying to me is how natural the action commands feel. You can intuitively figure out the timing on most attacks in the game just by visuals alone. The fact that the game doesn't outright tell you the timing for every action adds a level of skill development that wouldn't exist otherwise. Getting better at Super Mario RPG requires you to get better at animation reading and timing. Outright telling the player when to press the guard button is a small, meaningless change in the grand scheme of things. but it psychologically changes how we approach the action commands. It goes from a process of experimentation and practice solely to a quick-time event. I personally find that to be less compelling than what the original game did, but you do you. Normally, I'm not a fan of action commands in RPGs since they tend to be unrefined. Either they provide the player with too much of an advantage, or the minigame becomes intrusive. Games that feature action commands to keep combat engaging sometimes do the opposite for me. If you can get the minigame down once or twice, then you can probably do it every time. This transforms what could have been a cool skill check into a slower version of standard turn-based combat. Which is funny because a lot of developers include this kind of stuff because people already complain about the speed of turn-based games. I don't know, Final Fantasy IV is still a pretty fast game to play compared to something like Legend of Dragoon, since you don't have to wait for that QTE crap. Super Mario RPG manages to avoid this problem because its timing-based minigames are short and to the point. It never feels like the game needs to slow down to allow the player to execute these commands. In fact, it's the opposite. Mario RPG's mastery doesn't come from just getting okay at the game. Rather, it offers avenues for skill expression. The biggest example would be with the super jump ability. This special ability allows Mario to continuously bounce on a single enemy to rack up a bunch of damage. But the catch is that the timing of this action becomes more and more strict as the chain continues. This is amazing because it allows the super jump ability to be useful for both casual players while still serving an alternative purpose for experts. If you get really good at the super jump, then it has the potential to be a more SP efficient version of the ultra jump, a skill with a similar mechanic but costs more to use and has random targeting in group fights. Despite Super Mario RPG having a simplistic combat system, the battles manage to stay consistently engaging thanks to tricks like this, at least for the most part. Random encounters are certainly nothing more than trash mobs. Again, as long as you notice damage values, all you really need to do is change your composition around and you'll be set. Bosses are where the battles start to get a bit more interesting, but only after a certain point. Early game bosses are simplistic, but players are still getting to grips with the controls and mechanics. Around the middle of the game is when the more mechanically complex ones are introduced. As I mentioned earlier, bosses that focus on magic damage are inherently more threatening. I wouldn't exactly say Mario RPG is a very challenging game, not at all even. I blew through almost every obstacle in my way without too much trouble. It was only around the end of the game that more thought needed to go into my skills and item usage. Maybe I would need to use a buff every once in a while, but I managed to beat this one without dying a single time. Not even the optional boss Kulix gave me much trouble, and I didn't even have a fully optimized party before fighting him. If there's something that I think needs to be said, it's that I don't mind when video games are easy, provided they have smart and compelling game design. To me, fun matters above challenge. However, sometimes, challenge can be a source of fun. To me, there's nothing worse than when a game presents a bunch of mechanics to the player, only for them to be ultimately meaningless to the experience. Why should I bother using these fun tools when they aren't nearly as efficient as the instant win button? Experimentation becomes negligible when brute force is all that matters, making games less interesting. In situations like that, higher levels of difficulty can serve as a decent solution. However, if a game is inherently less challenging than average, at that point, what matters is how much juice is squeezed out of the design. Mario RPG might be a pretty easy game, but it stays engaging because it constantly asks the player to use the tools at their disposal, though things could stand to be a tiny bit more challenging in a few areas. There's a certain point where Mallow was able to take out armies single-handedly thanks to his powerful and inexpensive magic. If you fully spec Mallow into magic and give him equipment to increase his speed, then he can blow enemies away before they even get the chance to react. This is a basic combo that the most seasoned RPG players will be able to figure out, but one that I don't think is immediately obvious to the intended audience. I'm sure kids who got their hands on this one back in the 90s would take to the playground and share their strategies. The core combat of Super Mario RPG isn't the most in-depth thing in the world, but it still manages to be fun in its own right. By using elements that players are familiar with, they'll be able to pick up and play this one without much trouble. Really, it's impressive how well the literal conversion of classic Mario gameplay into this different genre works. I wouldn't say that it fully tricks you into thinking you're not playing an RPG, because these two genres are just inherently different. You're going to need to manage equipment, item, SP, and all that, though it takes a bit of a back seat compared to the raw execution of strategies. Square and Nintendo probably fully realize just how simple Mario's combat is compared to something like Final Fantasy, which is why I appreciate this game for having a shorter than average runtime. It took me about 17 hours to do just about everything, and I'm sure some of that could easily be knocked off if I only focused on the main content. This means that the combat never overstays its welcome. There are clear gameplay goals established, and the game design manages to take advantage of all of that by the end of the journey. I was starting to feel a bit tired of the combat by the end of the Nimbus Kingdom, but there's only one dungeon left after that, 2 depending on how you view Smithy's area. What also helps with the gameplay pacing are the moments where Mario's platformer origins are paid respect. This is where I feel as though Mario RPGs really found its stride and became something that you can't find anywhere else. In other RPGs, the complexity of exploration is limited solely to map design. Stuff like mazes and resource management are the backbone of old school RPGs, since the literal battles were where the challenge lies. Mario RPG, on the other hand, makes the overworld content more involved, playing to the strengths of this being a platformer spin-off. Believe it or not, platforming is a big part about this game. Mario is known for one fucking thing, so it makes sense to put emphasis on that. These micro doses of alternate gameplay featured throughout the adventure does a lot in keeping the combat from getting stale, and vice versa. One moment you'll be drifting down a river, hopping between barrels and collecting coins, and in another you'll be riding a minecart, scaling walls, solving puzzles, and so on. Mario's origins as a platformer franchise is used to great effect here. It feels good to run around and jump over shit in this game, what else can I say? Though the issue we run into is depth perception. I'm a big fan of how this game looks, but it certainly hasn't aged well. 3D graphics were the next big thing at the time, and it was cool to see the Mario world and characters be rendered in never-before-seen detail. Sure, it's ultimately the same kind of 3D as Donkey Kong Country, but that style is still charming in its own right. Though when you combine this graphical style with what the designers expected for you to do with the movement, that's when things start to get a little annoying. Bowser's Castle in particular features a lot of awkward platforming. Tight jumps that require strict timing don't work too well with isometric graphics. It can sometimes be difficult to tell where Mario is in relation to the platforms. You can make jumps that feel like you should make it, but you'll either over or undershoot. This beanstalk part right here is genuinely hell. Unironically, the most difficult part of the game for me. Well, next to that stupid fucking Yoshi race anyway. Holy hell, this sucks. Super Mario RPG is a basic game. If you're the type of person that values complexity above all else, then you might struggle to find a lot to enjoy. The platforming is simple, battles are basic, dungeons aren't very long, and the story is your traditional good versus evil affair. If you go into this game with the expectations that it'll have the same priorities as something like Final Fantasy VII, then you'll be left wanting more. But it's like I said at the start of this video, not all games are made for everyone. Sure, Super Mario RPG might be simple, but simplicity is becoming something of a lost art form. It feels like games nowadays are bloated to hell and back, fully packed to the brim for the sake of marketing, or to live up to some nebulous quantity of content. Less can be more, and Super Mario RPG is proof of that. It's a tight-knit experience that knows what it wants to be, manages to capture the same vibe of the franchise it belongs to, and most importantly, has respect for its audience. At no point during the runtime does it ever feel like Mario RPG talks down to the player. It trusts them to figure out strategies and adapt to different scenarios. Accessibility is oftentimes boiled down to how much hand-holding a game has. Games can be accessible without feeling patronizing, and that is the true strength of Super Mario RPG. It's a game that anyone can pick up and play, regardless of skill level, but offers some avenues for the more dedicated player to flex their stuff. Sure, it might not be the most intense combat in the world, but it manages to accomplish what it set out to do. Over the years, Mario RPGs have changed and evolved dramatically, putting even more emphasis on the franchise's roots while also expanding the action command gameplay. However, even with that considered, I still think that Super Mario RPG does a better job at getting newcomers into this genre. This is because while those games are more comfortable with being their own thing, this one still feels like a classic role-playing game. Ultimately, Super Mario RPG does a better job at priming players to jump into more hardcore experiences than what came after it. So you know what, even after all these years, this game still manages to hold value in that regard. While I'm sure the remake is a great way to experience this one, the classic version still holds up today. It's a Super Mario game that's an RPG, and really, that's all it needed to be.